I think we're going to be taking a slightly different look, or I'm starting to take a slightly different look at life-saving and where we go with life-saving. That's a bit better. They're just the steps that I'm going to be going through, so let's not worry too much about them. When we go back and look at the whole area of water safety and life-saving, there are a couple of kind of fundamental truths, and one of them is reflected in the Her Majesty's Stationery Office paper on water safety, which boils back down to basically when somebody gets into difficulty, it's normally a bystander who sees the event. And quite often, if they can't get themselves out of the water, it is up to that bystander to take some kind of action, whether it is alert emergency services or actually get into the water and or attempt to perform a rescue. This is a mashup of different comments from a couple of different sources, but essentially, in stressful situations, individuals make errors for the following reasons. They underestimate the risk, we've heard of that today. They overestimate their abilities, we've heard that during the conference. We know because of the results, they fail to select the safest option, and then they either do things the way they think they should be done or the way they expect to do them. And the results of those actions aren't always the best. Kevin has done some work in New Zealand, and between 1980 and 2012, 81 would-be rescuers drowned. Now, the other interesting thing, also from Kevin's work, is that 47% of people, when they were surveyed, said they would jump in and rescue. In the Irish context, we reckon that there are between 6 and 8 people, would-be rescuers, every year who drown. I think this is unacceptable, and we need to do something about it. The other thing, many of you remember Stathis. His work, he made the argument that a lot of people, their expectations, their beliefs in how they perform rescues and things like that are based on what they see in the films, what they see on the TV. Earlier in the spring, John and I were down in the Marine College in Cork, where Patrick was presenting work he had done in relation to hypothermia and how people react to that. And John Leach was presenting on the psychological side of it. And he made the point that in emergencies, it's the mental side, not the physical side, to a very large extent, that let people down. When he was talking about the brain, and you heard him all speak about it yesterday, the brain has 4 basic areas. But the interesting thing, and I just wanted to touch on it, is the second one there, which has limited capacity. But one of the tricks the brain uses to improve limited capacity is that it has a set number of routines, and it looks and it kind of says, oh, last time I did this worked, so kind of it just moves from A to B. But if you're in a stressful situation and it looks like it might be a good idea, it doesn't consider necessarily the nuances of the particular situation. It just moves very quickly from the start of the heuristic or the kind of assumption to where it goes into action. And this, to some extent, is where we find people They believe the best way of rescuing somebody is you jump in and you drag them out. And as a consequence, it may very well be a contributory factor to why non-swimmers will actually jump in spite of the fact that they know that they can't swim. This is also reflected to some extent in John's work in the first-time problem, that the first time, because they're not used to a situation, the brain gets into an overload situation. The other thing I should say, I'm not sure that this is quite a logical layout of my arguments and my thought sequence. It's probably more of a sequence and order of ideas. In rescuing, in water safety, in drowning situations, we know a lot about the casualties. We know who drowns, we know where they drown, we know when they drown. I don't think we have done enough looking at the rescuer, and I think this needs to be looked at. So my thesis, I suppose, to some extent is we need to start answering the why for the rescuer. I've adopted a kind of a business process approach, and there's one that I like a lot, and those of you who have children will be mildly familiar with it, which is described as the why. And you have all had the situation with children where the child asks a question, you answer it, and then you get, but why? And then, but why? But why? And they say that if you can answer 3 whys in succession, you know your subject. If you can answer 4, you're an expert. And if you can answer 5 in succession, you're an absolute angel. Because probably at that stage, the child gets murdered. This why process is actually, for those who are interested, it comes from the Toyota car company, and a Mr. Toyota came up with the idea, so there is a truth behind it. So, the question, can we identify distractions or mental demands, and I call those stressors, that mentally hinder the lifesaver at a rescue scene? Now, this is where I declare my interest, and as Juanita very kindly said, yeah, I'm into volunteering and I'm into the whole volunteer situation. So my interest is the opportunist lifesaver. Last night, many of you were in Dublin. We're all lifesavers. How many of you actually looked over the Liffey Wall to see what kind of the environment was there? The other, so as I was saying earlier, the opportunist lifesaver, the person who happens to be there, the volunteer. The other group of people that I'm very, very interested in are my lifesavers. My kids that week in, week out, I have them at the pool, I teach them all the various skills, I teach them the knowledge, but at the end of the day, I do not want to end up walking up to one of their parents' home and say, one of your children got hurt or more serious. So this is where I'm coming from. I want to make sure that my kids are as safe as they possibly can be. When we are looking at ideas and examining ideas, conceptual models are a kind of a handy way of, I describe them as a skeleton to hang ideas on. And the one that I use when I'm looking at rescues and the whole water safety area or emergencies are my 6P principle. And the 6 Ps are people, place. The people, as you can see, fall into a couple of categories. You have rescuers, bystanders, casualties. You have the professional rescuer, you have the volunteer rescuer, and you can then continue the tree of information. The place, as I say, I just describe it as in, on, or under the water, and you can all think of the various places. The problem, then the other 4 Ps. First, the problem, and I go back to the military question there, what's happening and what can be done about it. Next, we need to put a plan in place. The plan employs various processes that are involved, and finally we have the product or the outcome. Now, my area, what I'm interested in is the plan. And when I was looking at the plan, I came up with the mental side of the plan. I came up with this model, and it deals more particularly with, normally it deals more particularly with stress in the context of mental stress and how people react to stress in normal living. But when I sat down and I looked at it, I said, hang on, there's a few things in here that might usefully transfer into our environment. The first thing, starting left to right, and we'll just take you through the various things. First of all, on the left are the stressors, and they were the things that I was talking about earlier, which are things that are likely to have an impact on the decision-making performance of the individual. Then the influence, stressors working with the context, and in the context, the circumstances of the occurrence of the stressor and its meaning in which the stress takes place. So you have a stressor and the meaning. Like, we can be here, you can have kind of what might be described as a problem, but because it doesn't relate here, it isn't, it doesn't affect us. Moving on into the stress area, and that's the perceived demand, where perceived demand exceeds resources and results in an undesirable psychological behavior or outcome or pressure. These are influenced by the coping strategies or the coping mechanisms that are in place. And the coping essentially is the amount of preparation, the amount of training, the amount of preparation and readiness that the individual has. And finally, what's described here is the stress, but the stress as in this context can, and we know that stress can be positive and negative. We know that we need a certain amount of stress to up the whole metabolic rate and thinking rate, and we perform not at our most relaxed, but when we're under a certain amount of pressure. However, once we go over that upper threshold, then our performance starts to drop again. So to go and look at these things, I'm a strong believer in looking at things in the real world. And when I was looking around, in the Irish context, we have awards for bravery. And we have a group called, Corla na Murigula, in other words, Bravery Awards. These were set up by the government in 1947. There are 4 levels of award: gold, silver and bronze medals, and then certificates. They're open to any person who displays bravery, and part of the structure, the approach to people achieving it is that a written nomination needs to be sent in. I think I have all of the reports that were made from the beginning up until 2015. If we look on the right-hand side of your screen there, you can see the headings: drowning, fire, animals, boats. The number of incidents that took place are listed, and then the number of awards granted. It's interesting that drowning is streets ahead of the rest of them. It raises a social question, I think, why there are so many drownings, but that's not my point of discussion today. Moving on to look at the actual data set that I looked at. I took the rescues, the water-based rescues from 1975 up to 2015. There were 96 cases. As I said, they were based on the published details in the report. The rescues that I used were only ones that were undertaken by private citizens. I excluded Gardaí, or our police, fire service, coast guard, lifeguards, military, because I was working on the basis that all of these are open to emergencies or emergency type training in their day-to-day life. So that would limit the validity of the outcome. My kind of findings I split into two areas. The first one I described as literature-identified stressors, and these would be environmental, task, and ambient stressors. And I'll just talk about the type of stressors in just a moment. The other group, the research-identified stressors, were headings, things that I saw in the report that I felt affected or could affect how the rescuer thought or might influence their thinking and put them under stress. And we'll talk about those subsequently. Just to make the point in relation to the research stressors, looking at the emergency reports, you could find that there were a number of different stressors coming into play in any one rescue. So the literature identified stressors, and these, interestingly enough, primarily came out of a book, Decision Making Under Stress, which dealt with how the American military, the American Navy, developed an intelligent computer systems. And the environmental stressors that they had identified in that were multiple information sources. Again, in a rescue type of situation, if you have a number of people there, you can see that it's the type of thing that a rescuer could easily encounter. Incomplete, confusing information, again, something we can associate with. Rapidly changing circumstances. I mean, the very, very simple one, if there is somebody in trouble in a river and they're disappearing down around the bend, it's changing. Performance pressure, if you have multiple casualties, alternatively, if you have a casualty that appears to be kind of close to our breathing problems. So you can see that stands up. The task load, the pressure time, and the ambient, the background noises. The ones that I identified in my researching the reports, I divided it into three: relationship, emotional, and situational. The relational one, I think many of you can recognize. Obviously, if there is a stranger in trouble, there is a stress there. There's no getting away from that. But if it's a member of your family, then the whole relationship thing, the demand on you goes up. In the emotional situation, if a child is in trouble, the stress is far, far greater than if it's somebody like me. Also, if you're in a situation where you feel that you have a duty to an individual, something like an activity leader, it poses a problem. The other thing, and I'll just finish off very quickly, the situational thing. What I found utterly fascinating was that there seemed to be certain type of situations or environmental situations where people seemed to see it as, I don't know whether it's an opportunity for bravery or an opportunity to say, this is something I've got to do. As you can see there from the statistics, rivers and floods seem to have a magnetic attraction to people. At night, again, you kind of step back and you say, why would people attempt rescues at night? They're obviously going to be putting themselves at significant risk. The vehicle, the number of times where people see vehicles drive off piers and the immediate reaction is jump in after and drag the people out. These are all things that we need to sit down and look at. The other ones, and I'm just skipping down to the bottom one, the potholes, septic tanks, witnessing somebody falling in. Those of you who know what septic tanks are know that they are not the most attractive environments. As well as that, then you know that the gases that build up in these things are, to understate it, very, very noxious. Yet, there is now the emotional thing, get the person out, get them rescued. And in the last 12 months, I can think of 3 situations in this country alone where would-be rescuers have died in those types of situations. The pothole situation, you may very well find that it was somebody out hill walking and they fell into a pothole that was semi-filled with water. So it may be that was relating to duty and duty of care. I'm going to kind of stop at this stage and just to make the point. These things that I have identified, the next step as far as I'm concerned with these is I think I need to go forward to start talking to would-be rescuers and see how these identified areas fit into the whole story of how they rescue, why they rescue, when they rescue, to try and build up the knowledge base on what the rescuer does, why they do it. As I say, we know about the casualty, we don't know about the rescuer. So, thank you.